everybody, it's me, Big Ugly Jim. All right, so let's take a look at the FLQ. And I promise I am going somewhere with this. I'm going to go back to that other tab and FLQ crisis. I did a search for the timeline and I found this from the Canadian Encyclopedia. So this will do the trick for us. If you're watching and you're not from Canada, this will answer some questions. If you're watching from Canada, it'll probably explain a little bit more than what maybe we're regularly aware of. The October crisis refers to a chain of events that took place in Quebec in the fall of 1970. The crisis was the culmination of a long series of terrorist attacks perpetrated by the Front de Libération de Québec, a militant Quebec independence movement. FLQ were responsible for more than 200 bombings and dozens of robberies between 1963 and 1970 that left 6 people dead. Their actions culminated in the kidnapping of British Trade Commissioner James Cross and the kidnapping and subsequent murder of Quebec Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte in October 1970. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau deployed the armed forces and invoked the War Measures Act, the only time it has been applied during peacetime in Canadian history. Remember, we redid the the War Measures Act for the whole convoy smashy, the Emergency Measures Act, I believe we called it, because it's not war measures. Trudeau could kind of get away with that because the bombings and things was very military in nature, but ultimately he was criticized for using the War Measures Act at the time. So, founding the FLQ. The FLQ is found... Oh, sorry, this was in March 1st, 1963. The FLQ is founded by 2 Quebecers, Raymond Villeneuve and Gabriel Houdon, and a Belgian, Georges Choter, who had fought with the resistance during the Second World War. Their thinking and their membership is shaped by the more radical elements of other independence movements in Quebec. These include the Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, the RIN, founded in 1960, the Comité de Libération Nationale, founded in 1962, which promoted violence to achieve political ends, and the Réseau de Résistance, RR, also founded in 1962, which believed in protesting through vandalism. The FLQ is influenced by anti-colonial and communist movements in other parts of the world, notably Algeria and Cuba. So again, not a right-wing organization, very left-wing. April 1st, 1963, bombs in Montreal. Bombs explode on the CN railway line and at the National Revenue building in Montreal. After being informed of the bombs, Prime Minister Jean Diefenbaker reportedly asked, "Is this Ireland? The fuck we doing blowing stuff up? Come the fuck out. We're not them Irishes." Because Diefenbaker was obviously a very progressive thinker. Published a manifesto in April 16th, 1963. The first FLQ manifesto, Message de FLQ à la Nation, is published. April 20th, the very next day, if I'm not mistaken. Did I read that right? Oh no, 4 days later. Wilfred O'Neill, a nighttime security guard at the Canadian Armed Forces Recruiting Center at Sherbrooke Street, Saint West in Montreal, or Street West, I don't know whether I'm assuming it's Street, is killed when a bomb explodes at the center. The FLQ claims responsibility. So this was their first act of terror. May 17th, 1963, Westmount mailbox bombings. At least 12 bombs, each made of dynamite, which honestly, because of my childhood, makes me think of like Bugs Bunny cartoons, are placed in mailboxes in Westmount. 5 of them explode. Sergeant Major Walter Leja of the Canadian Army is seriously injured when one of the bombs explodes as he's trying to defuse it. May 19th, 1963, the City of Montreal announces a $10,000 reward for information on the FLQ. The next day, the Quebec government announces a $50,000 reward. June 12th, 18 FLQ members arrested after military faction formed. On June 1st, the FLQ leadership meets and decides to form a separate military faction, the Armée de Libération de Québec, the ALQ. However, one of the people at the meeting denounces the group and informs the police of the FLQ's plans. By June 12th, 18 FLQ members have been arrested. Then we have this, whatever that is. I'm assuming it will say below. The first FLQ publication, the first issue of Le Cognier, The Hatchet, is the official publication of the FLQ, is published. More than 60 issues will be published by April 1967. October 7th, 4 FLQ members plead guilty Does anyone believe there may be batshit Albertans who would do their own ALQ? Oh, fuck yes. That's the thing. Diagolon is a good example of that. The various militia groups here are doing that. Actually, yeah, I'm thinking that low-key of certain Albertans. And that's the thing is, 100%, I see path of violence already taking place when you look at the reaction to indigenous protests, when you look at the reaction to Black Lives Matter marches, or even just black people talking in public with a microphone. Yeah, we have them, and they would fucking happily start doing the Alberta Liberation party kind of shit. So, 4 FLQ members plead guilty: Gabriel Houdon, Raymond Villeneuve, Jacques Giraud, and Yves Lebont. 4 of the 18 FLQ members who were arrested by June 12th pled guilty to manslaughter in the death of security guard Wilfred O'Neill. Their sentences range from 6 to 12 years in prison. A murder charge against George Scheuters is dropped due to lack of evidence. August 29th, 1964. International firearms robbery. The FLQ robs the International Firearms Gun Store in Montreal, stealing several cases of guns and killing employee Leslie McWilliams. Another employee, Alfred Pinish, is mistaken for a robber and killed by police. Now that sounds right. Cops killing random people? That feels like a true story. The CIBC building bombed. A bomb explodes at the head office of the CIBC in Montreal. May 5th, 1966, mail bomb kills secretary. Thérèse Morin, a secretary at a shoe factory in Montreal, is killed by a mail bomb. July 14th, 1966, Jean Carbeau, a 16-year-old FLQiste, is killed in Saint-Henri when his bomb explodes as he tries to arm it. The poor dear. April 15th, FLQ publication replaced. The last of more than 60 issues of Le Cognier, the official publication of the FLQ, is published in November 1967. The FLQ publishes the first issue of its new journal, La Victoire. It includes bomb-making instructions. Oh, there's the man. I almost said Justin. Mr. Pierre Trudeau. Having won the leadership of the governing Liberal Party, Pierre Trudeau is sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada. May 15th, Pierre Vallières, I'm assuming this is the publication of Negres Blancs d'Amérique, which I want to know what that means. The book depicts Quebec's working class as a colonized people and argues that their conditions can only be improved through armed revolution. I feel like this is bad words in French. I may very well be wrong, but I feel like this is bad words in French. Liberal Party wins June 25th. Trudeau's Liberal Party wins a majority government in the federal election. October 13th, the Parti Québécois is founded. The Parti Québécois is established through the merger of the Mouvement Souveraineté Association, led by René Lévesque, and the Ralliement National, RN, led by Gilles Grégoire. The Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, or RIN, an early independence movement that led to the creation of the FLQ, was dissolved. Its members were invited to join the PQ. October 14th, attempted bombings of political parties. Bombs are discovered and defused at Montreal's Reform Club, which is owned by the Liberal Party of Quebec, and at the Renaissance Club, which is owned by the Union Nationale. November 22nd, an Eaton's store bombed. One bomb explodes at the Eaton's department store in downtown Montreal. A second bomb at the store is removed and deactivated. December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1968. One bomb explodes at Montreal City Hall while another is defused. A third bomb explodes in front of the National Review building in Montreal, while a fourth bomb explodes in a mailbox in Ottawa. February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, stock exchange explosion. 27 people are injured when a bomb explodes at the Montreal Stock Exchange building. It causes an estimated $1 million in damage. March 3rd, Pierre-Paul Geoffrey, arrested for bombings at his downtown apartment in Montreal. He has 161 sticks of dynamite and 35 cylinders of Pentomex, an industrial explosive. Geoffrey eventually pleads guilty to 31 FLQ bombings between May 1968 and March 1969, including the explosion of the Montreal Stock Exchange. Faced with 129 charges, he receives 124 life sentences plus 25 years, the longest British sentence ever levied in the British Commonwealth. May 5th, FLQ members hijack a plane. Having fled from Canada to the U.S., FLQ members Jean-Pierre Charest and Alain Allard hijack a National Airlines Boeing 727 out of New York and order it to fly them to Cuba. September 29th, 1969, Montreal mayor's home is bombed. At approximately 5 a.m., bomb explodes in the exterior stairwell at the home of Montreal mayor Jean Drapeau. The mayor is not home. His wife and son, who were asleep upstairs, escape unharmed. April 29th, Quebec provincial election held. Robert Bourassa and the Quebec Liberal Party win the provincial election. The Parti Québécois, in its first election, wins 23% of the vote, but only 7 seats in the 108-seat National Assembly. Again, this is an example of how the democracy is harder than it looks. It's weird to me that 23% of Quebecers were like, yeah, let's go with the guys that are like associated with the terrorist group. But that actually is kind of how shit goes. But the fact that they won 23% of the vote and only got 7 seats out of 108, which is less than 7%, that's a thing. Kind of rude to murder unbeknownst people. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of rude to murder beknownst people. Okay, National Defense, June 24th, the National Defense Headquarters bombed. An explosion at the National Defense Headquarters building in Ottawa kills Communications Supervisor Jean-Dac Saint-Germain. July 12th, Bank of Montreal bombing attempt. A bomb consisting of 150 pounds of dynamite in a parked car is defused before it can explode outside the Bank of Montreal in downtown Montreal. October 5th, 1970, the kidnapping of James Cross. October crisis begins. British Trade Commissioner James Cross is kidnapped from his home in Montreal by 3 armed men, one disguised as a delivery man, shortly after 8 a.m. Ransom notes received by police that afternoon identify the kidnappers as the Liberation Cell of the FLQ. The members of the Liberation Cell are husband and wife Jacques Cosette Trudel and Louise Langton, her brother Jacques Langton, as well as Marc Carbonneau, Nigel Barry Amer, and Yves Langlois. In exchange for the release of Cross, the cell issues 7 demands, including the release of 23 FLQ political prisoners, $500,000, the broadcast and publication of the FLQ manifesto, and safe passage to Cuba or Algeria. October 6, 1970, governments respond. Mitchell Sharp, the federal minister of external affairs, describes the FLQ's demands as wholly unreasonable, but allows for further negotiations. Prime Minister Trudeau makes it clear that any decision will be made jointly by the federal and Quebec governments. Radio station KCAC receives notes from the FLQ threatening to kill Cross if their demands are not met. October 7th, the police arrest 30 people following a series of dawn raids. Jérôme Choquette, Quebec's Minister of Justice, states publicly that he is open to negotiations. Several French newspapers publish the FLQ manifesto. More radio stations are notified of threats to Cross's life. CCAC reads the FLQ manifesto on air. October 8th, manifesto read on Radio Canada. The FLQ manifesto is read in its entirety on television by Radio Canada anchor Gaétan Montreuil. Parti Québécois leader René Lévesque publishes a newspaper article imploring the FLQ not to inflict violence on Cross or anyone else. So René Lévesque feels a little more liberally in this example. October 9th, FLQ extends the deadline. The Liberation Cell provides proof that Cross is still alive and extends its deadline for demands to be met to 10 October at 6 p.m. Otherwise, the cell says it will execute Cross. Kidnapping of Pierre Laporte. Premier Robert Bourassa returns from a trip to New York where he was promoting Quebec's business interests. He faces criticism for having left at a time of crisis. René Lévesque calls on the government to save the hostages by meeting the FLQ's demands. At 5:40 p.m., shortly before the deadline, Quebec Justice Minister Jérôme Choquette announces that if Cross is released, the Liberation Cell will be granted safe passage out of Canada, but none of their other demands will be met. Shortly after the deadline passes, 2 masked members of the Chenier cell kidnap Quebec Minister of Labour and Minister of Immigration Pierre Laporte while he's playing with his nephew on his front lawn in Saint-Lambert. They had found his address in the phone book. Yeah, the phone book. Remember those? What a great idea they were. The Stalker book. October 11th, tensions intensify. Beyond the kidnappings. Elected officials in Quebec flood the police with requests for protection. Robert Lemieux, a lawyer representing the FLQ, is arrested. The Chenier cell, Paul and Jacques Rosé, Bernard Lortie, and Francis Simard, strikes a more militant tone in its communique than the Liberation Cell. It threatens to kill Laporte unless all 7 FLQ demands are met by 10 p.m. It also releases 2 letters written by Laporte, one to his wife and one to Premier Bourassa, shortly before 10 p.m. Bourassa announces on the radio that he will not meet the FLQ's demands, but that he is open to further negotiations. The Chenier Cell postpones Laporte's execution. October 12th. Conflicting communiques. The Liberation Cell contradicts the Chenier Cell by issuing a communique saying that Cross and Laporte will be released if the 23 FLQ prisoners are set free and the police cease all actions against the FLQ. Meanwhile, soldiers are deployed in Ottawa to protect high-profile people and locations. October 13th. CBC reporter Tim Ralph questions Prime Minister Trudeau at the front of the Parliament buildings. Ralph expresses concern about the heavy military presence in the city. Trudeau replies, "Yes, well, there are a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see the people with helmets and guns. All I can say is, go on and bleed, but it is more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people." Ralph asks Trudeau exactly how far he's willing to go. Trudeau responds, "Well, just watch me." Robert Demare, a senior official within the Quebec Liberal Party, begins negotiating with FLQ lawyer Robert Lemieux. Probably Robert Lemieux, but whatever. Negotiations resume. I love that they're called negotiations. Like, don't we not negotiate with terrorists? I know that's an American thing, but like, couldn't we do that one? Negotiations between Demare and Lemieux continue. Lemieux is now representing both cells, who have issued a joint communique. A signed statement from 16 leading Quebec figures condemns the violent actions of the FLQ, but calls on the Quebec government to negotiate the release of the hostages. The federal cabinet holds a special meeting to discuss options such as invoking the War Measures Act. October 15th, an FLQ rally. About 3,000 students attend a rally in support of the FLQ. They call on the governments to meet the terrorist demands. Later that evening, the Quebec government announces it will release 5 FLQ prisoners on parole and guarantee the 2 cells safe passage out of Canada in exchange for the return of the hostages. October 15th, troops in Montreal. Premier Bourassa announces that he has asked the federal government for military assistance in Quebec under the National Defence Act. Within an hour, 1,000 soldiers are deployed at key locations in Montreal. Bourassa and Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau request further federal assistance. October 16th, the War Measure Act is invoked. Prime Minister Trudeau assembles the federal cabinet at around 3:15 a.m. after receiving a request from the Premier of Quebec, the municipal government of Montreal, and the Montreal Police Force to invoke the War Measures Act to confront the state of apprehended insurrection in Quebec. The Governor-General signs the order at around 3:30 a.m. Under the emergency regulations, the FLQ is outlawed and membership becomes a criminal act. Normal civil liberties are suspended, and arrests and detentions are authorized without charge. So this is what the War Measures Act allowed them to do. Remember the Emergencies Act, which was like, we're going to go after the bullshit money that you've been raising? People are like, this is the worst example of fascism. Is it? Trudeau states that the government had no responsible choice but to act as it did, and that the fate of the 2 kidnapped hostages weighs very heavily in my mind. Progressive Conservative leader Robert Stanfield, former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, and NDP leader Tommy Douglas all voiced dissenting opinions in the House of Commons. Douglas likens the move to using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut. René Lévesque and Le Devoir publisher Claude Ryan also condemned the decision. However, public opinion polls indicate a clear majority of Canadians support invoking the act. October 17th, Laporte found dead. Within 48 hours of Trudeau's invocation of the War Measures Act, more than 250 people are arrested. They include labor leaders, entertainers, and intellectuals, so lefties. In a communique sent by the Liberation Cell, but not made public until 8 December, the cell announces it is suspending indefinitely the execution of Cross. This is an apparent attempt to encourage the Chenier Cell to do the same with Laporte. But at 10:50 p.m., Laporte's body is found in the trunk of an abandoned car near the Saint-Hubert airport. An autopsy later revealed he had been strangled. October 18th, police issue warrants for the arrest of Marc Carbonneau and Paul Rosé, who are wanted in connection with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. Additional warrants are issued on 23 October for the other members of the Chenier Cell, Jacques Rose, Bernard Lortie, and Francis Simard. October 20th, Laporte's funeral is held at Montreal's Notre-Dame Basilica. By this date, police have conducted 1,628 raids under the War Measures Act. October 25th, Montreal municipal elections. Mayor Jean Drapeau and his party are re-elected with 92% of the vote, sweeping all 52 seats. October 26th, appeal from Cross's wife, an appeal from Barbara Cross, James Cross's wife, to the FLQ is broadcast on radio station CKLM, CKLM. To those holding my husband, she says, I wish to express my confidence that as he is a victim of circumstances, he will be well treated. I entreat them to be free without to free him without further delay. Meanwhile, the Quebec Justice Minister announces that members of the Quebec Civil Liberties Union will be allowed to visit people who have been detained under the War Measures Act. I imagine the cops marching through the streets like Gestapo. Yeah, absolutely. And I guarantee you, much like we always see, when they get these extra measures, the use of them would not be solely, like if you're a lefty, you may as well just get trunked in the head because the FLQ are lefties and you're probably all the same. November 2nd, reward offer. The federal government and the Quebec government jointly offer a $150,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the kidnappers. November 6th, Bernard Lortie is arrested. Police raid an apartment in Côte de Neige and arrest Bernard Lortie. However, the other members of the Chenier cell hide behind a false wall in a closet and slip away the next day. Cagey fuckers. November 13th, 46 people charged. By this date, charges have been laid against 46 people under the War Measures Act. November 21st, Cross still alive. A letter from Cross dated 15 November is received by the authorities. It confirms that Cross is still alive. December 1st, 1970, Police Order Temporary Measures Act. An act to provide temporary emergency powers for the preservation of public order in Canada is passed by the House of Commons by a vote of 174 to 31. The act replaces the War Measures Act and will be enforced until April 30th, 1971. Two members of the Liberation Cell are arrested. Jacques Coste-Trudel and his wife Louise Langton are arrested by the Montreal Police December 2nd. You had no idea about all of this? Yeah, this is some fascinating time in Canadian history, like the shit that happened, and my whole point is to draw some corollaries with separation movements in Alberta and with the appealing to the far right that's happening with the election of Danielle Smith and stuff like that. So thus the whole point. But yeah, this is some cool shit. The FLQ crisis was fascinating. December 3rd, James Cross was freed. Police negotiate the release of James Cross in exchange for safe passage for all members of the Liberation Cell, including Cosette Trudel and Langto and their infant daughter, to Cuba. After being held in a room in a Montreal North apartment for 59 days, Cross had lost 22 pounds, but was otherwise in good health. He had not been harmed and described his captors as courteous. December 23rd, the troops withdrawal was announced. Trudeau announces that all armed forces troops will be withdrawn from Quebec by 4th of January. The Public Order Act remains effective until the 30th of April. Chenier cell members captured, the official end of the October crisis. This is December 28th, 1970. Paul and Jacques Rosé and Francis Simard are arrested on a farm south of Montreal. They and Bernard Lortie are later charged with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte on 5th of January. And the February 3rd, the impact of the War Measures Act. A report tabled in the House of Commons by Federal Justice Minister John Turner, who I believe would be the same John Turner who eventually became the Prime Minister John Turner for a while and was a total joke, reveals that 497 individuals were arrested under both the War Measures Act and the Public Order Act. 435 were released and 62 were charged. 32 of these were held without bail. March 12th, compensation for detainees. Quebec Minister Jérôme Choquette announces that the provincial government will pay up to $30,000 in compensation to people who were unjustly detained under the War Measures Act. And then Paul Rose sentenced to life. I think at this point we're just going to get this is the denouement. Francis Simard sentenced to life. Justified complaints. Quebec's provincial ombudsman files a report with the National Assembly stating that 103 of the 238 complaints over the applications of the War Measures Act and the Public Order Act are warranted and eligible for compensation. So that's probably worth paying attention to. Bernard Lortie found guilty. Jacques Rose acquitted. So following 17 hours of deliberation over 3 days, Jacques Rose is acquitted in the kidnapping of Pierre Laporte because Bernard Lortie refuses to testify against him. Lortie is sentenced to 5 months for refusing to testify. A jury acquits Rose of the murder, and then found guilty, being an accessory after the fact in the kidnapping of Pierre Laporte, sentenced to 8 years in prison. Canada won't extradite exiled terrorists. Trudeau announced that Canada will not ask France to extradite Marc Carbonneau and Jacques Langto, who are now in Paris after having fled to Cuba. In the following weeks, reports surfaced that Yves Langlois, Jacques Cossette-Trudel, and Louise Langtot are also residing in Paris. So that's why Paris sucks, is they got all of our terrorists. And March 1st, petition for release of prisoners. A petition calling for the immediate liberation of all political prisoners is circulated by an organization co-founded by FLQ lawyer Robert Lemieux. It is signed by more than 50,000 people, including 2 PQ members of the National Assembly and numerous high-profile individuals. The most high-profile prisoner, Pierre-Paul Geoffroy, who was responsible for 31 bombings between 1968 and 1969, including at the Montreal Stock Exchange, had been denied parole 3 times. Why the fuck would people want these people to be released? Like, they did a bad, they go to jail. That's how the system works. You get some guy who like blew a bunch of shit up, and you're like, you know what though? That's why pencils have erasers. Weird. Justice for FLQ in exile. Despite hopes among Quebec nationalists that a Parti Québécois government elected in 1976 would introduce a change of mentality regarding the FLQ terrorists, new Justice Minister Marc-André Bedard declares that justice will follow its normal course. If the FLQ members are currently in exile were to return to Canada, Cossette-Trudel and Langtot return. They are arrested and charged with conspiracy to kidnap, kidnapping, forcible detention, and extortion. They plead guilty to all but the latter charge on 31 May, are sentenced to 2 years in prison on 7th August 1979, and are released on parole in 1980. Imagine that. 2 years in prison for kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnapping, forcible detention, and extortion. 2 fucking years. Nothing. And then Jean Langtot returns from France, arraigned in court and released on bail, because, you know, he's probably not going to be a terrorist anymore. Charged with conspiracy to kidnap Israeli Trade Commissioner Moshe Golem. That's quite a thing. Pierre-Paul Geoffroy gets parole. Nigel Barry Amer arrested. Duchesne report was officially released, concluding that politicians did not provoke or prolong the October crisis in Quebec. I think it's great that we do sort of look backs on these kinds of things, but I don't generally trust them. I believe the Duchesne report talks about things that could have been done to prevent this and is relevant, and I could be wrong about that, but there was a report that came out that was relevant to like the shit we should have done with the convoy in opposition to how we handle things. But of course, we don't read this shit. In Ontario City and Council, Ontario Provincial, Doug Ford was silent, not a hint of noise, and only federally stepped in. We need at least 3 levels to keep everyone confused and not accountable. In Alberta, the only reason it got dealt with was RCMP, who could cross federal provincial boundaries, and they did not want to. The Coots blockade, you know, you see the video of the end of it where they're like singing "O Canada" and hugging the terrorists. That's fucking sweet. Marc Carbonneau returns. He's going to get conspiracy, kidnapping, forcible detention, extortion, sentenced to 20 months in jail and 3 years probation. Boy, that's a stiff sentence. Standing ovation for Jacques Rosé, appearing at the Parti Québécois convention in Montreal, receives a standing ovation. That's fucked. Yves Langlois sentenced, final member of the Liberation Cell to return from exile, sentenced for 2 years in prison for kidnapping James Cross, paroled on 27th of May, 1983. So he actually served a year. Not even a year. Like the 27th of May, that's like a handful of months. Must be fucking hard. Okay, well, and that's our timeline. That is the timeline of the FLQ crisis, which means it's also timeline for me to go have a smoke line. First off, I want to say thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Thank you to my patrons that support me on Patreon. I am a little streamer, and these people are all really awesome for supporting me. I try to put up stuff at least once a week, and I live stream every Saturday at noon Mountain Time on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, like an old man. Again, thanks for watching, and have a kick-ass day.